Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final WCA webinar for 2022. As many of you know, my name is Prue Klein, and I'm the Marketing Manager here at Wine Communicators of Australia. It's my pleasure today to welcome our guest presenter, James Atkinson, journalist and podcaster, well known for his award-winning podcast, Drinks Adventures. Excuse me. Today, James will provide a comprehensive overview of the podcast landscape with advice on how you can get involved regardless of your marketing budget and some pitfalls you should be careful to avoid. We have allowed plenty of time for any questions you may have for James to be answered at the end of his presentation. However, feel free to type them in via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen anytime during the presentation. As usual, this webinar will be recorded and a copy of the recording will be sent to you if you wish to watch it at a later time. It is now my pleasure to hand over to you, James, for today's presentation. Thanks.
Well, thanks, Prue, and thanks to WCA for having me today and indulging me to talk about, a media channel that I'm pretty passionate about. And it's kind of, I guess I've spent most of my career, writing rather than being a broadcaster. That's not how I thought things would pan out when I originally, studied at university some time ago. But now podcasting is kind of my livelihood. So I'm pretty passionate about it. I'm a little terrified about this because, one of the brilliant things about podcasting is it's all pre-recorded. You get to edit and finesse everything before it goes out. So this is a new experience, and let's hope it goes as smoothly as it possibly can. So just to sort of start off with, this is how I'm going to be structuring today. Just an introduction to what's coming up. First up, I'll give you a brief bio on myself and how I came to launch the Drinks Adventures podcast and kind of get into this space. We're going to go back though and kind of just cover some real basic fundamentals about what is a podcast, in case there's anyone who is with us today who hasn't yet sort of embraced podcasts. Why should you care? Why is this a medium that you should be including as part of your marketing mix? We'll look at podcasts in Australia. How is the medium sort of progressing in Australia? And we'll look at, we'll look at podcasts and wine. How significant is wine's, penetration as a genre of content in podcasting? And then at the end, I'll just give you some ideas of how you could get involved with your brand or your organization to have a think about if you might want to get involved, that don't necessarily involve starting a podcast, which is certainly not for everyone. And I'll explain a bit later on why that is. So just to sort of give you the overview of myself. So I graduated from a broadcast journalism degree a frightfully long time ago now, 1999. And I kind of thought that I would work in radio. That was what I had in my mind that I wanted to do, but, it just didn't really pan out that way for me. I kind of have mostly done print for, throughout my career. And, the first decade or so was pretty eclectic. I did sort of, some general news stuff, a lot of business stuff for various different B2B publications. I'm into my music. So there was, some sort of freelance music writing in there. I even did sport for a while. And it wasn't really until I got the job editing theshout.com.au, which I'm sure most of you in the industry would be familiar with, that I kind of fell into the whole drinks industry. And like many of us, haven't looked back. We all seem to kind of get a job in the drinks industry and then we become lifers. So I was at The Shout for a few years. I then edited a beer publication called Brews News, and I've been a pretty prolific freelancer writing for pretty much every drinks publication in Australia at one time or another. So the relevant, milestone, I guess, for today is that in 2018, I founded the Drinks Adventures podcast. And I was kind of looking at the landscape, the podcast landscape. I was getting really into podcasts myself, listening to a lot of podcasts, and just seeing there wasn't really a huge amount in the drink space. Generally, there was some very category specific podcasts out there, particularly in beer. Beer is extremely prolific in podcasting versus other categories. There's dozens of beer podcasts. They're mostly, podcasts with two guys that have beards talking about the IPA that they're drinking. They're very extremely niche, not really kind of trying to bring new people in. And actually wine, though, there wasn't really much out there at all. And there still isn't a huge amount out there in the wine space. So I was just sort of looking at that and thinking that, surely there's got to be a space for an open-minded drinks podcast that didn't kind of respect the traditional category boundaries, because we all are seeing these days that, consumers are, their repertoires, their drinking repertoires are becoming a lot broader. It's, much more common these days for people to go out and have a Aperol Spritz or a gin and tonic and then have some wine with dinner and maybe a whiskey after dinner or a beer along the way or whatever it is. And so I guess that's kind of as much as I am a wine lover, this is a WCA webinar, so I really should highlight that I do love my wine, but I kind of tend to see it in the context of drinks more broadly. And so Drinks Adventures kind of celebrates that and tries to sort of, I always try and convert people across from other categories to get them interested in wine if it's not their thing, or get them interested in whiskey if they wouldn't normally be whiskey drinkers or whatever it is. So Drinks Adventures, it started out as a side hustle pre-COVID, and then, like a lot of people in 2020, I kind of had to adapt what I was doing because a lot of my traditional freelance avenues of work dried up, and I kind of decided I'd better focus on my own title, because, that was something that I was in control of. An editor couldn't turn around to me and say, we don't have any more work for you now. And I think since I've focused on that for the last 2.5 years, it's really kind of gone to another level. And, I've sort of launched a website off the back of it and an EDM, but the podcast is the star of the show. But there is a website with news and features and stuff as well, and the EDM as well, which is sort of weekly-ish for the most part. Drinks Adventures now has 168 episodes. It's won a few awards, which is great recognition, and it's now generating in the early thousands of weekly listens. I'll say that much. It's not quite up to some of the benchmarks that people talk about. 10,000 listens a week is sort of like a benchmark for what is probably considered a really successful podcast, particularly for an indie podcast in Australia. There would only be a handful of podcasts in Australia that would have hit that sort of, would have that kind of listenership and audience base. And that's still a little way off for me, but I do feel like now, after 4 years and nearly 170 episodes and a lot of hard work, that I'm kind of starting to get into that realm. So that's me. Moving on to, as I said, we're just going to go back to the real fundamentals here. What is a podcast? Well, there's two ways you can answer that question. The technical answer is, and this is historically what has been considered a podcast, an audio file in MP3 format distributed via an RSS feed. So RSS stands for really simple syndication. And it's a way of sort of, if you embed an RSS feed on a website, then it's a way of basically feeding through news or feeding through a podcast episode. And, that's sort of the way that if you've got Apple Podcasts, that's the way that it works, is just through someone uploads a podcast episode and it feeds it directly into their phone. So that's sort of historically what a podcast has been considered to be since 2005, when Apple basically made podcasts part of iTunes, which was a big milestone for podcasting, which has only been around for a few years prior to that. So it's about 20 years old, really. So what is a podcast? The practical answer is it is on-demand audio. So it's like a radio show, but it's on demand. So I think recent events in the media industry have kind of made that sort of technical answer that I gave first up a little bit less relevant, because the media landscape's just evolved, and it's evolving so quickly. We've seen YouTube really being embraced for listening, not just video. I've always found it a bit weird because I see YouTube, YouTube is somewhere I go to watch videos. I don't necessarily go there to listen to, an hour-long conversation, an hour-long interview. But there are a lot of what people call podcasts now being sort of built on YouTube. And, they are, it is possible for people to listen to these while they're on the move, like they would a podcast. If you subscribe to YouTube, if you pay for the premium subscription, you don't have to have your screen open to be able to listen to a YouTube video. And so I think that, we have to basically treat these as podcasts because I think when there's been surveys done of consumers about where they listen to podcasts, a lot of people come back with YouTube, and YouTube is it's in the process now of kind of starting to embrace that sort of use of its channel a bit better. Rather than considering itself video only, it's kind of becoming a video and audio platform. And, obviously YouTube's owned by Google. Google has another product called Google Podcasts. And I think probably what will end up happening is Google Podcasts and YouTube are kind of going to get amalgamated. We've also seen, Spotify signing exclusive podcasts in inverted commas. And the reason I put them in inverted commas is once it signs these exclusive podcasts, they're no longer being delivered to people through an RSS feed, an open RSS feed, which was what underpinned what a podcast was. But now that, Joe Rogan being the most obvious example is exclusive to Spotify, not technically a podcast, but looks and smells like a podcast. Let's call it a podcast. And, now we've sort of seen the rise of subscription-based podcasts on Apple and other platforms as well, even Patreon, if you're familiar with that. They're not on an open RSS feed anymore, but, it's on-demand audio, a bit like ABC iView or Netflix. So yeah, on-demand audio is the key thing here. Now, why should you be interested in this channel? Well, I'm sure this is something that you will have heard before, is just sort of the sheer amount of advertising messages that we're all getting bombarded with on an average day. So there's a lot of research out there that an average person, I think this is in the US, but we wouldn't be too different, I wouldn't think, sees up to 10,000 advertisements every single day. Apparently it's somewhere between 4,000 and 10,000, depending on, what your career is and how active you are online and all that kind of stuff. So, how do you make an impression on a consumer as a wine brand with your advertising campaigns? How do you actually get them to recall what your campaign is, what your message is in that environment? It's obviously incredibly difficult. But one channel that is actually showing itself to be quite powerful in that landscape is podcasting. So the Interactive Advertising Bureau did a study, and it found that consumers have much higher levels of concentration, 71%, while listening to podcasts versus watching TV shows, 56%, or posting on social media, so 50% for that. And, this is in sort of an environment when, consumers are also reportedly becoming blind to display advertising, with only 14% of them able to recall the last display ad that they saw. And, conversely with podcasting, and there's been, myriad studies about this, like there's so much stuff out there that you can very easily Google and find, why podcast marketing is powerful. But yeah, 78% of podcast listeners approve of sponsorships. They don't sort of resent that the podcast has a sponsorship relationship, and 67% can accurately recall the products and brands that were mentioned in podcast advertisements, and that's from the IAB once again. And I think, a lot of the reasons why podcasting is achieving these results and why it is different to some of these other media is because it's an extremely unique channel. When you are listening to a podcast, you are, most of the time you're listening alone, and a lot of the time you are also listening through headphones as well. So this is some data from another study. It's by Edison Research. It's really robust data. This is what the whole industry kind of relies upon to see what the penetration and what the growth of podcasting is in Australia. So podcast listening locations, at home is the lead one. But when we sort of look down this list, in a car, whilst walking around, whilst riding on public transport, at a gym, these are all sort of listening occasions where there's not so many of the disruptions of other advertisements. There are some, but it's not the same as, when you're advertising on social media being the obvious one where, people just have such short attention spans and they're getting absolutely bombarded and they look at one thing for 30 seconds and go on and do something else. At home is the number one there, but I actually sort of argue that the listening to podcasts that happens at home, it's also kind of immune to some of this advertising fatigue as well, because I know myself that when I listen to a podcast at home, it's typically in my earphones while I'm doing a really menial task like ironing or unloading the dishwasher or hanging out the washing. It might even be when I'm in bed. I might just, before I nod off to sleep, I might listen to a show as the last thing that I do. So once again, you're not getting that sort of disruption that you are with a lot of other media. And I think, driving, walking around, they're just, people are so engaged with podcasts in a way that they can't be with a YouTube video, for example. So yeah, captive listeners, and what you do get with the podcasts that have kind of created a habitual listening with their audience is quite an intimate connection between the host and the listeners. So they're tuning into your show each week. The reason they like it is due in part to the host and their presentation style. They feel like they know the host as well. They get to feel like they know you a bit. So there's an authenticity there that I don't think exists in some other media. And what that means for advertisers and sponsors is that they can leverage that trust that a host has cultivated with their audience. So, if an ad is done well on a podcast and it's read by the host, it sort of comes across more like an honest recommendation from an expert or a friend, rather than just a real cynical money grab. Rather than, people sort of tend to resent advertising, and I don't think they do on podcasts in the same way. And there's just also the fact that, audiences are more likely to trust what they are hearing, given they have opted into listening. You've got to think about the fact that these people who are listening to a podcast, they're there because they want to be there. It's not because, they just happen to be subjected to some radio and an ad has come on. So yeah, it's just a very different relationship between host and listeners. So bit of an overview of podcasts in Australia and how the medium is tracking. Podcasting awareness in Australia. So as you can see there, really steady growth since 2017 when Edison started doing this study. Excuse me for a second. Up from 72% of the population, 72% of the population in 2017 were aware of podcasting. That peaked at 91 last year, and 90 this year in 2022. I think we could pretty much call that flat. I suppose that we're probably pretty much close to what we could call full podcasting awareness with those kinds of results. When we actually look and actually, Prue, I don't know if it's too early for you to give me the results of the poll that we've just run.
So 75% yes and 25%.
Absolutely. So 75% of the audience on today's webinar have listened to a podcast in the past month. So
wow. Well, that's just music to my ears. 75%. So you are the people who are tuning in today, you're over-indexing with the Australian population. So you can see this slide. This is pretty fresh research. This has come out in the last couple of months. monthly podcast listening. So 40% of the Australian population aged 12 and over have listened to a podcast in the last month, and 75% on this call, which is awesome. And as you can see, there was a really big spike between 2020 and 2021. I think we all know what happened there. Every man and a dog started a podcast, and people with a lot of time on their hands were looking for new things to do, and podcast listening really did get a shot in the arm as a result of the pandemic. And still some good growth between 2021 and 2022. And I think, this Edison data, it's often compared with the American market. We were behind for the last few years. Up until now, we've been behind the American market. We're now very much in line with listenership, on a per capita basis with America. So it's sort of a pretty pivotal time for where podcast listenership is in Australia. And I think, it's been around, as I said, since, 2005 or earlier than that, technically speaking, so 20 years, but really the last few years is where it's really taken off. Average time spent listening to podcasts. So this is what would be known as super listeners. So these are like absolute devotees. So people who listen to podcasts on a weekly basis. And 2022, we saw a record high, over 7 hours that the percentage of Australians who listen weekly are listening in for. 7 hours, that's a lot. I would describe myself as a podcast devotee. I listen to a lot of podcasts, but I'm not sure I even do 7 hours. It's quite remarkable. It's not surprising, I don't think, given everything that I've been telling you, that we're seeing a lot of interest in this medium from advertisers, and the podcast advertising landscape is really maturing. So this is data that came out yesterday, very fresh, from a company called Magellan AI. So they use artificial intelligence to basically look. They do analysis of thousands of episodes from more than 400 of Australia's most popular podcasts to work out who are the biggest advertisers, and work out, how spend has increased or decreased. And so this came out yesterday. You can see the top 15 podcast advertisers there. Amazon, number one. I think they're doing a lot of advertising with their Prime video service. A few other brands you might have heard of there. There's no wine, obviously, which, obviously wine generally probably has much smaller budgets, but I wouldn't think it's out of the question that we could see some wine brands in there at some stage. But overall, this is the key stat. Australian podcast advertising grew by 33% year on year compared to the same quarter in 2021. So yeah, some really impressive growth, but I think, again, it's important to say it's early days, and this channel is not as competitive as a lot of other media channels are. So, for those of you who are listening in today and taking note, then, it's a fairly small number of wineries compared to the overall industry. So bit of a first mover advantage for you if you decide to take action in podcasting. Looking at wine as part of the content mix in podcasts overall, I think it's pretty fair to say that it's a very niche player. There are at the moment 4 million podcasts listed in the podcast index. I think that's actually more than doubled in the last couple of years since COVID happened. But the thing with that is that there's 4 million podcasts, but not many of them are actually active. There's a lot of people that start podcasts and it turns out to be more effort than they think that it's going to be. And they make a few episodes and then they move along and do something else. And so this particular research that I've drawn upon here, it found that only 13% of those podcasts had produced an episode in the last 90 days. And only 4% had produced a total of 10 episodes and had a new one in the last week. So basically from that, they sort of deduced that there are really only 155,000 active podcasts worldwide. And if you look on the left, this is where what the leading subject areas are. So religion, business, society, news, sports, education, health, I'm not seeing wine here. Maybe it should be in religion for some of us, but I believe that it is part of arts. For whatever reason, food and drink, it tends to be part of arts for the purposes of these categories. So it's pretty niche, but I guess, those of us that are in the industry and those of us that, we're in a bubble, we tend to often get the sense that, that wine is bigger in the media landscape than perhaps it is. So I think it's probably not that surprising, really. Bit of an overview here of some of the wine podcasts that are out there. If you're new to you're obviously podcast listeners, which is great. But if you're looking to just get an idea of the landscape and get an idea of the shows that are already out there, this is just a few of the ones that are well established. So yeah, Wine for Normal People. It's an American podcast founded by wine educator Elizabeth Schneider in 2011. By now it has 8 million all-time downloads, which is really quite significant, and 480 episodes. I'll drink to that with Levi Dalton. Levi is a sommelier or a former sommelier, I believe, based in New York City. And he interviews wine personalities in his apartment, and he's been doing that for 491 episodes. So he's got a pretty significant audience, I think. The UK Wine Show, founded by wine educator Chris Scott in 2006, 710 episodes, a real wine podcast pioneer. Couple of more recent ones that seem to have pretty good traction. Bottled in China with Emily Steckenborn. Emily was based in Shanghai. I think she's been back in America, or I think maybe she works for Moet Hennessy in Hong Kong now. But yeah, she's got a great podcast. It's very global, even though it's called Bottled in China. It's quite global in its outlook. Unreserved Wine Talk, that's by the what have we done here? Yeah. Sorry, just one second. Unreserved Wine Talk. So that's Natalie McLean, the Canadian wine writer. She founded that in 2018 and has 205 episodes. So moving on to Australia, fair to say that we're not as well established here. There's, I started in 2018 with mine, but there were others that came before it. The Vincast, James Scaresbrook's podcast. He's a bit of a pioneer of wine podcasts in Australia. I think he started his in 2013, and it has to date 126 episodes. But it's been inactive for a while, and I think James just got busy with his winemaking, with his family, and has kind of moved on. Some of the other shows that have come up since then, shout out to Meg and Mel. I'm not sure if Mel or Meg are on the line, because I noticed that Rob Dolan Wines was one of the companies that registered for today's webinar, and I think both Meg and Mel work for Rob Dolan, but their podcast isn't about Rob Dolan Wines. It's basically about wine and generally, and they'll just explore different varieties or speak to different people in the industry. So that's a good one to check out, and they've got 80 odd episodes under their belt. A few of the other ones that have come up just in recent years, we've got Some, which is Master Sommelier. I can't remember the gentleman's name, I apologize, but yeah, this is a newer one that's out there. The Cellar Door podcast. There's Over a Glass with Shante, who probably some of you know. And then AWRI Decanted. So that's kind of more of a technical industry, show where Drew Radford meets a scientist working for the Australian wine industry, or a producer who is putting wine research into practice. So shout out to them, because I think that together with Megan Mel and AWRI Decanted, we are the three podcasts that were shortlisted for the Wine Podcast of the Year, or Best Wine Podcast in the Wine Communicators Awards this year. So yeah, not a whole amount out there in the wine space, I would say, overall. And, that might suggest that I would say, well, why don't we all go away and start a wine podcast? I'm not going to do that. I I do think that there is room in the market for more high quality wine podcasts, but the right ones. And I don't want to sound negative about the podcast space at all, because I'm not. I think that, I mean, you've already heard how sort of how passionate I am about it, and the sort of potential that I think that it has for wine and for the industry generally. But I would just caution anyone who's thinking of going down the path of launching a podcast, just to be sort of aware of what you're getting yourself into. I've been going for 4 years now, and bloody hell, it's been hard. Like, it's been a lot harder than I thought it would be to get to the point that I've gotten now. There are really low barriers to entry, to start a podcast. Anyone could, start a podcast with, you could record on your phone, you could buy a really cheap microphone, and you can get it out on the internet that day. And, it's really easy to start a podcast, but it's a lot harder to start something that's high quality and deliver that on a regular basis. And it is, extremely time consuming and expensive as well to do it properly. So if you want to make a show that's, highly produced, sounds great, that people are going to be able to hear well, when they're out in the car, when there's a lot of background noise, when they're driving on a motorway, when they're just out walking, when there is a lot of background noise. That's when I find that a lot of podcasts fall down, is if they haven't been professionally mixed. It can often be difficult to hear what people are saying, and that really can put people off. So that, I have paid, ever since I started Drinks Adventures, I've always paid to have it professionally mixed. And I have, the editing that I do with it is quite painstaking. So it's quite common for me to take a 50-minute interview and then cut it down to half that length, if I think that's what's best for the listener. A lot of hours spent doing that, I can tell you. And I'm now at a point where I outsource that editing for the most part. And that's been a bit of a game changer. But of course, that cost me money to do that, just like the professional mixing does. You've got to write the show notes. You might have a website that you've got to maintain around the podcast. And then this is the real kicker, is just the marketing of it. You've got to sort of really expect that once you've finished making it, you've then got to devote the time to marketing it. And I know that with Drinks Adventures, this is the thing that I'm the worst at, because I'm a one-man show, I'm a sole trader. And while I do outsource some tasks, marketing is something that I just do myself when I have the time. And I don't really have the time to devote to social media because I'm so busy making a podcast. So I think it's really important, if you're thinking of going down this avenue, you have to take a long-term view and just think about, is this something that I'm still going to be wanting to do week in, week out in 2 years' time? Because for the most part, the podcasts that are successful and that do get traction are the ones that have been around for a long time. There are exceptions to this rule. Like if you do have a big budget, then you can produce a shorter podcast and have the money to campaign around that podcast and cross-promote it through other channels. But for the most part, I don't think a podcast is something where you can just come in, release a 6, there are exceptions to this, like you can do a short run podcast if it's like a true crime thing that's really sensational, it's going to get a lot of traction. Or if you're a celebrity, you can probably do a short run thing. But for most of us, for us mere mortals, it's like a slow incremental growth thing. And yeah, it takes years to build, and it's gotten harder. This is the thing as well. Like it's in 2022 now, that there are 4 million podcasts or whatever it is. There is a lot more noise out there. Even though a lot of these aren't active, they're still in the search engine when if people type in wine to find a podcast, then there's a lot of wine podcasts in there that haven't put out an episode in a long time. So discoverability is a lot harder. And, the gatekeepers that are out there from the likes of Apple and Spotify, they've got their own shows now that they want to promote. They want to promote the shows that have got paid subscriptions, because they obviously get a kickback on that. And so it's just gotten a lot harder for your show to be discovered. I've certainly noticed that getting support from Apple to promote anything these days is incredibly difficult. the other point I'd make is, if you are planning on doing this, is if you're a winery that's planning on going down this path, it can't just be about your brand, because it's just going to sound like an ad for your brand. It sort of needs to be more, elaborate and more, you need to kind of be bringing in other people and talking about other things rather than just, here's an interview with our cellar door manager or whatever it is. Like, that's going to get boring pretty quickly. I don't think that's really a successful basis for a podcast. And, the final sort of thing I'll just add here is, listeners have limited repertoires. One quote that I like, which I used to hear when I was at the Shout and always speaking to a lot of liquor retailers, was with all of the new products that were coming onto the market, they'd say the shelves aren't made of rubber. So basically, all this NPD that's coming to the market's great, but we can't fit all of it onto our shelves. We need to have, we can only support so many new products each year. And it's the same with listeners. So these sorts of hardcore listeners that I'm talking about, that we talked about earlier, that are listening to, 7 hours of content a week, even those people, they generally only subscribe to a certain number of podcasts, and that hasn't really changed. So the average number of podcasts subscribed to by podcast listeners, as you can see, it peaked at 10 in 2020, and in 2022 it's 8 podcasts. So if an average person is subscribing to Conversations with Richard Feidler and the Hamish and Andy show, and maybe some other entertainment podcast and a cricket podcast, and then they've got a wine podcast in there. Anyone who's launching a new podcast now, you've got to sort of think about, are you going to be able to knock off one of those other podcasts off their perch and get into that person's subscriptions? And that's not an easy thing to do. So yeah, these are just things that, as I said, I really don't want to sound negative about people starting podcasts, because I'm not. I think that there is actually opportunity for the right podcast to come to market, but I think that it's got to be people that are coming into it with their eyes open, with a plan that's fully baked, not half baked, and really thinking about what they're going to be wanting to do, whether they're going to be wanting to do this in 2 or 3 years' time, because that's ultimately where you're really going to start to get a bit more traction, is once you've got that bigger archive of content, and once people are more likely to have discovered you, because it takes time for people to discover a podcast. So here's some other ideas about how else to get involved if you're not planning to start a podcast. You can pitch your talent as a guest, obviously, and not just to wine shows. There is obviously a limited number of wine-related podcasts that are out there, but maybe there's an avenue for you to pitch someone in your business to, a business podcast or a marketing podcast or whatever it is. There are lots of shows out there that are sort of related to wine. Maybe it's agricultural, maybe it's tourism, that sort of have a really close relationship to wine. And some of them have really big audiences, and, they're produced on a weekly basis, a lot of them. And so they are looking for quality guests. You've just got to have a strong enough pitch and a strong enough angle to make that appealing to some of these podcasts. Probably the most sort of obvious way to get involved is programmatic advertising. So this is really sort of essentially a bit like the equivalent of buying a package of radio advertising, but in podcasting. So you essentially get your ad made. You would probably go to an agency to produce a podcast ad, and then you buy a package of impressions that would run across a bunch of different podcasts that have relevant audience demographics. This is sort of a way to get a higher reach campaign in podcasting. It's a more expensive way of doing things. It's something that I've heard Dan Murphy's do. I think Jacobs Creek has had a go at doing this type of thing as well. You're getting some of the benefits of the medium, because, going back to what I was talking about before, you're still reaching people who are in that sort of listening occasion where they're driving or they're walking the dog or they're doing the ironing or whatever it is. and you're sort of getting that cut through that you probably can't get with a lot of other media. But then you're not really leveraging the authenticity of having the host of a specific program, sort of telling their audience about your product. And so the next option that I put here is a targeted sponsorship. So this is like a more sort of higher engagement play. The reach could still be good, but it's probably, you're not going to be able to just buy reach like you are with programmatic advertising. It's still probably going to be, depending on the show, it's probably not going to be cheap. But what I'm thinking of here is sort of more national shows that might have a natural affinity with your brand, a really well-suited audience profile. And these types of shows, even if they've reached the dizzying heights of, the 10,000 listeners that I mentioned earlier on in this presentation, even if they're there, it's the revenue that they get from programmatic advertising is really not that much. It's quite small. So it wouldn't be that hard for a wine company to come in and talk to some of these shows and thrash out a deal. And this could, depending on, how they're structured, they might have an agent, or, there's lots of different ways that this could work. But it wouldn't be that hard to thrash out a deal that would work for them and could have really significant upside for you, because you are leveraging that sort of authenticity that they have, that sort of intimate connection that they have with their listeners that I spoke about earlier. And, the ads, if done right, they shouldn't really feel too much like ads. They should feel a bit more natural and feel like that host is really going into bat for your brand. Grassroots sponsorship. So this is kind of similar to the last option that I just mentioned, but the sort of podcasts that we're going to be talking about here are going to be quite a lot smaller. So this is just going to be a matter of like looking around. It's going to take some work, but I think I would do this if I had a winery and I wanted to go down the avenue of podcast marketing. I would reach out to podcasts and try and find the right ones that had that just worked with the brand, and try and grow together with those podcasts. And the way that you might be able to do that is, so I've just said here, you've got to obviously find those shows that align with your business. It's not easy to do, but one avenue to do that is a site called listennotes.com. You can go there and basically, you could just sort of type in, let's say you're a Mornington Peninsula winery and you want to target podcast listeners in Melbourne. You could type in Melbourne and try and find some hyperlocal Melbourne podcasts. And, you might be able to support them with some product for giveaways initially, just sort of tell them that you like what they're doing. Ultimately, I think, if you're interested in really seeing this podcast grow over time, it probably needs to evolve into a paid sponsorship type relationship, because, it costs these podcasters money to make their show, but they might only just be looking for something to help them offset some of those costs. They're not going to be looking for big bucks. And you might have other assets to them, like, maybe you've got a venue where they can do a live recording or something along those lines. Listennotes.com is quite good because you can just type in, as I said, in this Mornington Peninsula winery example, you could type in Melbourne and basically just go through and search and sort of look at all the different podcasts that are there that have Melbourne in the title. And it will give you like a ranking, like a listen score and a percentage. So for the top, what it has found to be the top 10% of all podcasts, they get a score and a ranking of what percentage of the market that they're in. So are they in the top 5% of podcasts in terms of popularity globally? I think these metrics are a little bit problematic. I don't really trust them perfectly, but it gives you something. And the other thing that it will easily allow you to see is when the podcast was founded. Was it something that just sprung up a few months ago, or has it been around for a few years? How many episodes does it have? And other things that you could use are the Apple Podcast charts that yeah, the charts are not based on actual listens. It's got nothing to do with that. It's just a trending chart. But if you look at the Apple Podcasts food chart, for example, you're going to be able to go through there and work out what are some of the podcasts, the Australian podcasts that are in that chart. And yeah, just get your head around some of the shows that are out there. Australian Podcast Awards is another way to kind of see what some of the high quality shows are that are out there that have recently been recognised. And you can go and listen to them and see what sort of commercial relationships that they have presently and see whether there might be a way for your brand to get a foot in the door. Yeah, check that the production is high quality. You know, you kind of want to be, you know, obviously aligning your brand with a quality production. And just make sure you know what they're about. You know, you don't want to be kind of going in there cold and approaching them without really getting your head around their show and making sure that it fits what your brand's trying to do. And, you know, the sorts of relationships the sorts of deals that you can have with these podcasts, no one deal is going to be the same, but yeah, host-read ads, like I sort of spoke about before, cross-promotion opportunities will help you build your podcast with our audience because you know, we think that it'll be of interest to them and you can help us build our wine brand with your audience. Giveaways, obviously, it's great for them to help build their audience and live events, like I mentioned before. So this is, I really believe there's a lot of potential for not just wine, but, you know, a lot for brands generally to be working with podcasts on this much more sort of accessible level of grassroots sponsorship. So I think that's pretty much everything that I have today. It's like a really, you know, quite a huge, expansive topic to be covering, but I hope I've just kind of given you a little bit of an overview of the space and where it's at in Australia and some of the potential that I think it has for wine. So I'm hoping that there are some questions, which I'm more than happy to answer. And I'll just put up this final screen as well if you want to get in touch with me. If you haven't checked out Drinks Adventures, I'll get the shameless plug in here and say that definitely do so. A lot of amazing wine content on there, among other things. In recent weeks, I've had, you know, Mount Pleasant, McWilliams, Shaw and Smith, just to name a few of the wineries that I've featured on the show. And so those are my details. And if you've got any questions or anything that you, want to reach out, be more than happy to help.
Amazing. Thank you so much, James. And yeah, I've certainly learned a lot in the past 45 minutes about that whole podcasting landscape. And it sounds very competitive, but really exciting. And I know from personally listening to podcasts as I walk, you're so right that you really do tune into it and feel like you're having like a one-on-one conversation. So it's a really nice channel to communicate with wine audience for sure. So we do have a couple of questions. I was going to kick it off with one for you from me, actually. You talked about like the pitch and wine producers reaching out to, you know, potential podcasts to feature them. As a journalist and podcaster, what are you looking for in the pitch that's different from writing a story in an article versus interviewing someone in a podcast?
Yeah, I mean, good question. You need someone to talk to who is what in the journalistic world is referred to as good talent. So they're like articulate, they're well spoken, they're generally confident. I mean, everyone gets nervous before they sort of do an interview to some extent. I mean, I've been a journo for 23 years. I think I still get nervous before every interview that I do. So there's going to be nerves there for most people. But yeah, you just need someone who's able to speak well, because it can be a lot of editing. If there's a lot of, you know, you can turn a bad interview into a good one, but you know, ideally you want someone who speaks well to begin with. I think for me, it's sort of about the story as well. Like it's got to be, you know, certain stories are going to work better than others in terms of sustaining a podcast episode of like 20 plus minutes. It's got to be just something that's really interesting, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And advertising costs, sort of putting you on the spot here, but a bit of a guide, like you referred to some that can be a really big investment for a wine producer. What are we looking at, like, for someone to do one of those ads, you know, mid podcast, etc.? What's sort of the guide range of pricing for advertising?
I mean, it works out to be like, I can tell you what producers can get paid at the end of it, which is, you know, 25 cents. It's $25 CPM, so cost per 1,000 impressions.
Yep.
So, you know, I'm sure that probably if you were going to buy a package of these ads, then you'd be talking in the thousands of dollars, and, you know, you would be getting a lot of impressions, a significant number of impressions for that, in a very scattergun kind of way across many different podcasts. You know, that's kind of where I think programmatic advertising is. You know, look, if you've got the budget to do it, you know, then, you know, I mean, people spend money on billboards, and, you know, it's like that old thing of 50% of your advertising spend is wasted, but no one knows which 50% of it is. So I'm sure it does work to some level, but I do think that the prize is kind of where you've got a more sort of integrated relationship with the podcaster, and they actually know your brand a bit, and they're able to talk about your brand to their listeners in a way that's very authentic. So I don't know if that answers.
Absolutely. No. So a few questions have come through on the Q&A, which is fantastic. Someone's asked, will podcasts ever be fully monetized medium? It's an interesting one, thinking into the future.
Yeah, I think it'll be sort of like the internet, you know, like sort of like there'll always be, you know, podcasts that are just people making something for fun that they have no intention of monetizing. And then, you know, there are also going to be some that are going to be, I mean, monetization is happening. It'll continue to happen. I don't know that they're going to be fully monetized ever, that you're going to have to pay to use every podcast, because some are worth paying for. So I think it'll just be a bit like the internet in you know, in that there's many different models of how people can choose to monetize if that's the path.
Like, I know some that I listen to, there's the free section, and then there's the value add, which is the subscription content, and I think that is a great way to go, because it gives them a bit of a teaser of the content to then upgrade. So I've got a question from someone who's in your industry, your space, who's considering maybe starting a podcast, and you spoke about the importance of high quality equipment, etc. So I'm assuming from that using, you know, investing in mics versus recording something on an iPhone is strongly recommended.
Yeah, I mean, you can sort of, it depends what you're
starting out.
It really all depends on your ambitions, you know, like it's sort of like I could say I want to make wine and buy some table grapes and throw them in a bucket, and, you know, I would make wine, but it wouldn't be that drinkable. I mean, if you go back to the first season of my show, like, my equipment was nothing like what it is now, and also I actually have learnt how to do a good recording now. Like, my knowledge of how to use a microphone has really evolved along the journey, and so the quality of what I'm doing has improved. And that's not just to do with equipment, quality of equipment. Equipment these days is pretty, you can get a good microphone for a few $100, and I'm not talking $500. I'm talking sort of, you know, probably more like $300. You can get a decent microphone for that. Yeah, look, you need to invest in, I would suggest you need to start with a good mic. It doesn't need to be great. And you need to sort of get some pointers on how to use it. That's sort of the number one thing. If you don't know, you know, how close you need to be talking to the microphone, and what your recording environment should sound like, you know, if you're recording in echoey rooms, then, you know, for example, that is something that can sound pretty bad in the recording afterwards. And that's something that, you know, I'm learning as I go along. So I don't want to sound like I've got all the answers here, you know, like when COVID happened, before COVID, I recorded 99. I mean, I think I recorded all my interviews face to face before COVID, because I was actually traveling then and I was getting out to different places and meeting interesting people. And so I was able to sustain a podcast doing it that way. And so, yeah, since COVID, it's all been about learning how to record online and do that seamlessly. And there's been a lot of headaches to get, with that. It's not easy. It's difficult. The tech stuff is kind of the worst part of it, I think.
Yeah. And this same person's just asked about any tips on editing software. Got any particular software that you found when you were editing yourself worked pretty well for someone starting out?
Yeah, I mean, I use a program called Hindenburg Journalist, which is pretty sort of user-friendly and pretty easy. So I would recommend that just for, but when I send it off to my professional guy who does my mixing, and he normally works in Pro Tools. So yeah, you might, I suppose, the thing that I would say as well that I haven't said in this section, in this Q&A section, is just that to sort of have access to someone who is able to help you with the sound quality, polishing what you've made. You can't fix a shit recording. You can kind of tweak it a little bit and make it better. But I guess the best way to get a quality result is by starting with a good recording, but then you still do need someone who's good at with audio to finesse that recording.
Great advice. Fantastic. Yeah. The next question is, can you comment on the ideal length of a podcast and the listenership that might drive? Do longer podcasts lend themselves to commuters, for instance? And compliments that they loved your insights today.
Oh, thank you, Anonymous. The ideal length of a podcast, well, is a thing that people in the industry say it's as long as it needs to be and no longer. So like you should edit, get out all of the dross. I really hate it when I listen to a podcast and the first few minutes is people talking about what the weather's like, where they are, how they just ran a half marathon, what they had for dinner last night. No one cares about that. And a lot of the time, by the time they listen to the podcast, like whatever the weather was weeks ago, it really doesn't matter. So you've got to like just get down to the nitty gritty of what the episode's about, and edit it as tight as you possibly can. There's been a lot of people sort of talk about 20 minutes being the sweet spot, and that's because the average commute time. But I don't think it really, I think it's just about the having quality content that goes the duration of the episode and that's not going to lose people halfway through. There are so many podcasts that I start listening to and don't make it through because I get bored. And so that's something I'm always striving for, is to be like, how are people going to be at this point of the episode? Are they still going to be engaged? And I've had, in my nearly 170 episodes, I've had a couple that have gone close to an hour, but not quite. And even though I've felt like it's been a really interesting conversation that was worthy of having that amount of time spent on it, when I look at the completion rate, it does go down. So people, not too many people, there's a lot of, the longer that the episode is, the more the chance that they're going to drop off and not stay until the end. So you've just sort of got to be aware of that.
Yeah, and a bit of trial and error, I imagine, when you're first starting as well. The next one is from Bill. He mentions that you recorded a successful documentary on McWilliams. Is there more scope for docos rather than interviews?
Yeah, well, that was kind of very much a passion project, and I really love doing it. I've done a few of them now. I did one on Stone and Wood Brewing Company as well, and I did another one on Chuck Hahn, the Hahn Brewing pioneer. And I've experimented with other sort of more narrative format ones. I mean, there was one a couple of weeks ago on Aussie wheat beer, sort of a new beer style that was not documentary, but kind of narrative with multiple voices. I'd love to do more of that sort of stuff, but it's basically like doing 20 podcast episodes in one. So it's not the best use of my time. So I think, with more industry support, as I can kind of grow my revenue and make it a sustainable thing, then the more chance there is of me being able to devote the sort of time that those projects involve to doing documentaries.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's good to know that someone appreciated it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again for your time today, James. We don't have any more questions, so we're just going to wrap things up. Thank you to everyone that attended. This was our last webinar for the 2022 program, and we'll be back again in February next year, so keep an eye on that space. For all WCA members, our recordings from previous webinars are all stored on the website under the education section, so go in and check those out. And to the wider audience, if you have any suggestions on webinar topics you'd like us to cover in next year's program, please email me at wca@winecommunicators.com.au. Wishing everyone a wonderful rest of the year and Christmas and New Year. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you back online in 2023. Take care. Thank you.